Chapters 25 through 26 of History of Rome from the earliest times down to 476 A.D. by Robert F Pennell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Richardson. Chapter 25. Marius and Sulla, Cinna. With the name of Marius is usually coupled that of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, 138 to 78. He was a patrician of the purest blood, had inherited a moderate fortune, and had spent it, like other young men of rank, lounging in theaters and amusing himself with dinner parties. He was a poet, an artist, and a wit. Although apparently indolent, he was naturally a soldier, statesman, and diplomatist. As quaestor under Marius in the Jugurthine War, he had proved a most active and useful officer. In these African campaigns, he showed that he knew how to win the hearts and confidence of his soldiers, and through his whole subsequent career, the secret of his brilliant successes seemed to have been the enthusiastic devotion of his troops, whom he always held well under control, even when they were allowed to indulge in plunder and license. It was to Sulla's combined adroitness and courage that Marius owed the final capture of Jugurtha. He served again under Marius in the campaigns against the Cimbri and Teutones, and gave efficient help towards the victory. But the council became jealous of his rising power, and all friendly feeling between the two ceased. After this campaign, Sulla lived at Rome for some years, taking no part in politics, and during this time his name and that of his rival are almost unheard. He appeared before the public again in 93, when he was elected praetor, and increased his popularity by an exhibition of 100 lions in the arena, matched against Numidian archers. In 92 he went as propraetor to govern the province of Asia, and here he first met Mithradátes. This monarch, who ruled over Pontus, was an extraordinary man. He spoke many languages, was the idol of his subjects, and had boundless ambition. He doubted the durability of the Roman Empire, and began to enlarge his own territory with no apparent fear of Rome's interference. Cappadocia, a neighboring country, was under Roman protection and was ruled by a prince, Ariobarzanes, that Rome had recognized. This country Mithradátes attacked. He killed the prince and placed on the throne his own nephew. Rome interfered, and Sulla was instructed to visit the monarch. He accomplished his mission with his usual adroitness, and returned to Rome with new honors. He took an active part in the social war, eclipsing the fame of his rival Marius. He was now the recognized leader of the conservative and aristocratic party. The feeling between the rivals was more bitter than ever, for Marius, though old, had by no means lost his prestige with the popular party. It was at this time that Mithradátes, learning of the social war, thought it a good opportunity to advance his own interests and extend his realm. He collected all his available forces, and invaded Bithynia. With his fleets he sailed through the Dardanelles into the archipelago. The extortions of the Roman governors had been so great that Ionia, Lydia, and Caria, with all the islands near Asia Minor, gladly revolted from Rome and accepted his protection. All the Roman residents with their families were massacred on a single day. It is said that 80,000 persons perished. Mithradátes himself next crossed the Bosphorus and marched into northern Greece, which received him with open arms. Such was the condition in the East when Sulpicius Rufus carried the bills mentioned in the last chapter. One of these bills was that Marius have charge of the war against Mithradátes. This was not to Sulla's liking. He was in Campania with the legions that had served in the Social War. The soldiers were devoted to him and ready to follow him anywhere. Sulla, therefore, taking matters into his own hands, marched into the city at the head of his troops. The people resisted. Sulpicius was slain. Marius fled for his life and retired to Africa, where he lived for a time watching the course of events. Sulla could not remain long at the capital. The affairs of the East called him away, and no sooner was he gone than the flames of civil war burst out anew in 87. Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a friend of Marius, was consul that year. He tried to recall Marius, but was violently opposed and finally driven from the city. The Senate declared him deposed from his office. He invoked the aid of the soldiers in Campania, and found them ready to follow him. The neighboring Italian towns sent him men and money, and Marius, coming from Africa, joined him with 6,000 troops. They marched upon Rome. The city was captured. Cinna was acknowledged consul, and the sentence of outlawry which had been passed on Marius was revoked. The next year Marius was made consul for the 7th time, and Cinna for the 2nd. Then followed the wildest cruelties. Marius had a bodyguard of slaves, which he sent out to murder whomever he wished. The houses of the rich were plundered, and the honor of noble families was exposed to the mercy of the slaves. Fortunately, Marius died 16 days after he entered office, and the shedding of blood ceased. For the next 3 years, Cinna ruled Rome. Constitutional government was practically suspended. For the years 85 and 84, Cinna himself and a trusty colleague were consuls, but no regular elections were held. In 84 he was murdered, when on the eve of setting out against Sulla in Asia. Sulla left Italy for the East with 30,000 troops. He marched against Athens, where Archelaus, the general of Mithradátes, was entrenched. After a long siege, he captured and pillaged the city, March 1, 86. The same year he defeated Archelaus at Chaeronea in Boeotia, and the next year at Orchomenos. Meanwhile, Sulla's lieutenant, Lucullus, raised the fleet and gained 2 victories off the coast of Asia Minor. The Asiatic king was now ready to negotiate. Sulla crossed the Hellespont in 84, and in a personal interview with the king, arranged the terms of peace, which were as follows. The king was to give up Bithynia, Paphlagonia, and Cappadocia, and withdraw to his former dominions. He was also to pay an indemnity amounting to about $3,500,000 and surrender 80 ships of war. Having thus settled matters with the king, Sulla punished the Lydians and Carians, in whose territory the Romans had been massacred, by compelling them to pay at one time 5 years' tribute. He was now ready to return to Rome. The same year that Cinna died, Sulla landed at Brundisium with 40,000 troops and a large following of nobles who had fled from Rome. Every preparation was made by the Marian party for his reception, but no sooner did he land in Italy than the soldiers were induced to desert to him in immense numbers, and he soon found himself in possession of all Lower Italy. Among those who hastened to his standard was young Pompey, then but 23 years old, and it was to his effort that Sulla's success was largely due. The next year, 83, the Marian party was joined by the Samnites, and the war raged more fiercely than ever. At length, however, Sulla was victorious under the walls of Rome. The city lay at his mercy. His first act, an order for the slaughter of 6,000 Samnite prisoners, was a fit prelude to his conduct in the city. Every effort was made to eradicate the last trace of Marian blood and sympathy from the city. A list of men declared to be outlaws and public enemies was exhibited in the Forum, and a succession of wholesale murders and confiscations throughout Rome and Italy made the name of Sulla forever infamous. Having received the title of Dictator, and celebrated a splendid triumph for the Mithridatic War, he carried 80 to 79 his political measures. The main object of these was to invest the Senate, the thinned ranks of which he filled with his own creatures, with full control over the state, over every magistrate and every province. In 79 he resigned his dictatorship and went to Puteoli, where he died the next year from a loathsome disease brought on by his excesses. The reforms of Sulla. Sulla restricted the power of the magistrates to the advantage of the Senate. Senators were alone made eligible for the tribuneship, and no former tribune could hold any curule office. No one could be praetor without having first been quaestor, or consul, without having held the praetorship. Every candidate for the office of quaestor must be at least 30 years old. The number of the praetors was increased from 6 to 8, that of the quaestors from 12 to 20. The consuls and praetors were to remain at Rome during their first year of office, and then go to the provinces as proconsuls and propraetors. 300 new senators taken from the Equites were added, and all who had been quaestors were made eligible to the Senate. The control of the courts was transferred from the Equites to the Senate. On the death of Sulla in 78, Crassus and Lepidus were chosen consuls, but such was the instability of the times that they were sworn not to raise an army during their consulship. Lepidus attempted to evade his oath by going to Gaul, and when summoned by the Senate to return, marched against the city at the head of his forces. He was defeated by Crassus and Pompey in 78, and soon after died. Chapter 26. Sertorius, Spartacus, Lucullus, Pompey, and Crassus. Quintus Sertorius in 121 to 72, a native of the little Sabine village of Nursia under the Apennines, had joined the party of Marius, and served under him in the campaigns against the Cimbri and Teutones. In 97 he served in Spain, and became acquainted with the country with which his fame is chiefly associated. In 91 he was quaestor in Cisalpine, Gaul. He was a partisan of Marius during his troubles with Sulla, and on Sulla's return from the East he left Rome for Spain, where he took the lead of the Marian party. His bravery, kindness, and eloquence pleased the Spaniards. Many Roman refugees and deserters joined him. He defeated one of Sulla's generals, and drove out of Lusitania, Portugal, Metellus Pius. Footnote: son of Metellus Numidicus, he received the agnomen of Pius on account of the love which he displayed for his father, whom he begged the people to recall from banishment in 99. End of footnote. Who had been specially sent against him from Rome. The object of Sertorius was to establish a government in Spain after the Roman model. He formed a senate of 300 members, and founded at Osca a school for native children. He was strict and severe towards his soldiers, but kind to the people. A white fawn was his favorite pet and constant follower. He ruled Spain for 6 years. In 77 he was joined by Perperna, a Roman officer. The same year Pompey, then a young man, was sent to cooperate with Metellus. Sertorius proved more than a match for both of these generals, and defeated them near Saguntum. The position of the Romans was becoming critical, for Sertorius now formed a league with the pirates of the Mediterranean. He also entered into negotiations with Mithridates, and opened correspondence with the slaves in Italy who were rebelling. But intrigues and jealousies arose in his camp. The outcome of these was that he was treacherously murdered by Perperna at a banquet in 72, and with his death fell the Marian party in Spain. Meanwhile, a dangerous enemy was threatening Italy within her own borders. In 73, a band of gladiators, under the leadership of one of their number, named Spartacus, escaped from the training school at Capua, and took up a strong position on Mount Vesuvius. They were joined by large numbers of slaves and outcasts of every description, and were soon in a position to defeat 2 praetors who were sent against them. The next year they assumed the offensive, and Spartacus found himself at the head of 100,000 men. 4 generals sent against him were defeated, and for 2 years he ravaged Italy at will, and even threatened Rome. But intestine division showed itself in his rank. His lieutenants grew jealous of him, and his strength began to wane. In 71, the command of the war was given to Crassus, who finished it in 6 months. Spartacus fell, fighting bravely near Brundisium. Pompey, returning from the Sertorian war in Spain, met 5,000 of those who had escaped from the array of Spartacus. These he slew to a man. Crassus pointed the moral of his victory by hanging, along the road from Rome to Capua, 6,000 captives whom he had taken. Mithridates, meanwhile, taking advantage of the troubles at Rome, was again in arms, and in 74 Lucius Licinius Lucullus was sent against him. Lucullus, of plebeian birth, first distinguished himself in the social war, where he gained the favor of Sulla, and accompanied him as quaestor in his campaign against Mithradátes in 88. With Cotta he was chosen to the consulship in 74. The province of Cilicia was assigned to him, Bithynia to Cotta. Mithradátes invaded Bithynia, defeated Cotta, and besieged him at Chalcedon. Lucullus, after reorganizing and disciplining his army, went to the aid of his colleague, drove the king into Pontus, and defeated him at Cabria in 72, and his fleet at Tenedos in 71, compelling him to take refuge with his son-in-law, Tigranes, king of Armenia. Lucullus endeavored to work reforms in the administration of provincial governments in the East. The revenues of the provinces were farmed out, and the measures of Lucullus were intended to protect the taxpayers against the tax gatherers, the Publicani. His reforms met with bitter opposition at Rome, especially from the Equites, whose chief source of income was often this same tax farming. Intrigues against him by persons sent from Rome began to create dissatisfaction among his troops. He had been a severe disciplinarian, and so it was all the easier to turn the soldiers against him. In 68 he won a victory over Tigranes and Mithradátes at the river of Arsanias, but his legions refused to follow him farther, and he was obliged to lead them into winter quarters in Mesopotamia. The next year his soldiers again mutinied, and he was replaced by Pompey. Returning to Rome, Lucullus spent the rest of his days in retirement, dying about 57. He was very rich, and was famed for the luxurious dinners which he gave. Pompey and Crassus. The Sullan system stood for 9 years, and was then overthrown, as it had been established by a soldier. It was the fortune of Pompey, a favorite officer of Sulla, to cause the first violation of the laws laid down by his general. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, 106 48, led a soldier's life from his boyhood to his death. When a youth of 17, he fought by his father's side in the civil struggles between Marius and Sulla. He was a partisan of the latter, and connected himself with the cause of the aristocracy. He defeated the followers of Marius in Sicily and Africa, and in 81 was allowed to enjoy a triumph, though still an acus and not legally qualified. Sulla then greeted him with the surname of Magnus, which he ever afterwards bore. He was then sent to Spain, with what success we have seen in the previous chapter. In 70, Pompey and Marcus Licinius Crassus were elected consuls amid great enthusiasm. Crassus, 108 53, the conqueror of Spartacus, had amassed immense wealth by speculation, mining, dealing in slaves, and other methods. Avarice is said to have been his ruling passion, though he gave large sums to the people for political effect. Neither Pompey nor Crassus, according to the laws passed by Sulla, was eligible to the consulship. The former had never been quaestor, and was only 35 years old. The latter was still praetor, and ought to have waited 2 years. The work of Sulla was now quickly undone. the tribunes regained their prerogative, the veto. The control of the criminal courts was transferred again from the Senate to the Equites, and the former body was cleared of its most worthless members, who had been appointed by Sulla. For 3 years (70 to 67), after the expiration of his consulship, Pompey remained quietly at Rome. He was then put in charge of an expedition against the Greek pirates. From the earliest times these marauders had been in the habit of depredating on the shores of the Mediterranean. During the civil wars of Rome they had become much bolder, so that the city was compelled to take an active part against them. They had paralyzed the trade of the Mediterranean, and even the coasts of Italy were not safe from their raids. Gabinius, a Tribune, proposed that Pompey should hold his command for 3 years, that he should have supreme authority over all Roman magistrates in the provinces throughout the Mediterranean, and over the coast for 50 miles inland. He was to have 15 lieutenants, all ex-praetors, 200 ships, and all the troops he needed. In 3 months the pirates were swept from the sea. The next year, 66, Pompey's powers were still further enlarged by Manilian law, proposed by the Tribune Manilius. By this law the entire control of the Roman policy in the East was given to Pompey. His appointment was violently opposed by the Senate, especially by Catullus, the father of the Senate, and by the orator Hortensius. But Cicero, in his first political speech, Pro Lege Manilia, came to Pompey's assistance, and to him was given the command by which he became virtually dictator in the East. His operations there were thoroughly successful, and though he doubtless owed much to the previous victories of Lucullus, he showed himself an able soldier. Mithradátes was obliged to flee across the Black Sea through Panticapaeum, Kerch. In the year 64 Pompey went to Syria, took possession of the country in the name of Rome, and made it a province. Next he was invited to act as judge between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, 2 aspirants to the Jewish throne. His decision was contrary to the wishes of the people, and to enforce it he led his army against Jerusalem, which he captured after a siege of 3 months. He installed Hyrcanus on the throne on condition of an annual tribute. Meanwhile Mithradátes had returned to Pontus for the prosecution of his old design. But so great was the terror inspired by the Roman arms, that even his own son refused to join him. Desperate at the turn affairs had taken, the aged monarch put an end to his own life in 63, after a reign of 57 years. With him ceased for many years all formidable opposition to Rome in Asia. Besides Syria, Pontus, to which Bithynia was joined, and Crete were now made provinces. Cilicia was reorganized and enlarged by the addition of Pamphylia and Isauria. The 3 countries in Asia Minor, not yet provinces, but dependencies, were Galatia, ruled by Deiotarus; Cappadocia by Ariobarzanes; and Paphlagonia by Attalus. After an absence of nearly 7 years, Pompey returned to Rome, January 1, 61, and enjoyed a well-earned triumph. He was 45 years old, had accomplished a really great work, had founded several cities which afterward became centers of Greek life and civilization, and was hailed as the conqueror of Spain, Africa, and Asia. The rest of Pompey's life is closely connected with that of Caesar. His wife Julia was Caesar's daughter, and thus far the relations between the two men had been friendly. Pompey's absence in the East was marked at Rome by the rise to political importance of Caesar and Cicero, and by the conspiracy of Catalina. End of chapter 26. Chapters 27 through 28 of History of Rome from the earliest times down to 476 A.D. by Robert F Pennell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Richardson. Chapter 27. Caesar, Cicero, Verres. The Caesars were a family belonging to the Julian gens, which claimed descent from Iulus, the son of Aeneas. 8 generations of Caesars had held prominent places in the commonwealth. They had been consuls, praetors, censors, aediles, and were aristocrats of the modern wing. The direct ancestry of Gaius Julius Caesar can be traced no further back than his grandfather. This gentleman, of the same name as the great Caesar, married Marcia, who claimed descent from Ancus Marcius, the 4th king of Rome. They had 3 children: Gaius Julius, the father of the dictator Sextus Julius, and Julia, who became the wife of Marius. Gaius Julius held no higher office than praetor. He was married to Aurelia, a stately woman of simple and severe tastes. Their son Gaius was born on July 12th, 100. During Cinna's consulship in 86, Caesar is first mentioned as a youth, tall, slight, handsome, with dark, piercing eyes, sallow complexion, and features refined and intellectual. The bloody scenes attending the proscription of his uncle, Marius, to whose party his father belonged, must have made a deep impression upon him. One of his most intimate companions was Cicero, who was 6 years his senior. Marius had seen in his nephew the materials which make great men, and determined to help him to promotion. He made him, when scarcely 15, a priest of Jupiter, Flamen Dialis, which sacred office carried with it a handsome income. Shortly after the death of his father in 84, Caesar married Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna. By this marriage he was connected more closely with the popular party, whose champion he remained. When Sulla returned to Rome from his eastern campaign, Caesar was but 18. In the wholesale murders that followed, his party was ruined, his nearest friends dispersed or killed. He himself was yet free from proscription, for Sulla wished to win such a promising young man to his own side. He made proposals that Caesar divorce his wife and marry one whom he might select. Caesar refused. Force was then tried. His priesthood was taken from him, and his wife's dowry. His estate was confiscated, and, when this had no effect, he was himself declared an outlaw, and a price was set on his head. Influential friends, however, interceded in his behalf, and the dictator was finally persuaded to pardon him, but with reluctance, and with the remark that in Caesar was the making of many a Marius. The youth then left Italy and joined the army of Asia. Here Caesar served his apprenticeship as a soldier. He joined the forces of the Praetor Thermus, who had been sent against the pirates that were making their headquarters in Lesbos. The Praetor, finding his troops insufficient to accomplish his work, sent Caesar to Nicomedes, a Roman ally and the king of Bithynia, to obtain additional forces. He was successful in his mission, and upon his return to Lesbos, distinguished himself for his bravery in the attack upon Mytilene, and was awarded the oak wreath, a coveted honor, for saving the life of a fellow soldier. Caesar's next scene in Cilicia, serving under Servilius in a campaign against the pirates who were marauding along the coast of that country. While here he was informed of Sulla's death, and at once left the army and returned home in 77. The next year he began his struggle with the nobility by prosecuting for extortion Dolabella, a former governor of Macedonia. Dolabella was a favorite of the Senate, and his cause was theirs. The best talent was engaged to defend him, and Caesar lost the case. Feeling his deficiency as an orator, Caesar went to Rhodes and studied rhetoric under the famous Apollonius. He had recovered his property and priesthood, and could well afford the time. While on his way he was captured by pirates, and not released until a ransom of some $50,000 was raised and paid. Upon arriving at Miletus, he at once got together some vessels, returned to the island where he had been in captivity, seized the crew of pirates, took them to Pergamus, and had them tried, convicted, and crucified. He then resumed his journey to Rhodes, where he remained 2 years in the pursuit of his studies. Then the report of the uprisal of Mithridates reached him, and he at once crossed over to the mainland, collected a body of volunteers, and saved Caria to Rome. Having finished his studies, Caesar returned to Rome and lived quietly for a time with his wife and mother, watching the course of events. While Caesar was thus preparing himself for the great struggle in which he was destined to take the leading part, Cicero, the companion of his youth, was beginning to attract attention at Rome. Marcus Tullius Cicero, 106 43, was a townsman of Marius. He belonged to the Equites, and received a good education under the best Greek teachers. As he ripened into manhood, he chose in politics the party opposed to Caesar, and for a profession he selected the bar, hoping to gain fame as a speaker before the Senate, and finally to become one of its members. He took part in the Social War of 89, but during the troubled times that followed he remained quietly engaged in literary pursuits. His first public oration in 80, the defense of Roscius, who was falsely accused of murdering his father, was a great success, and guaranteed for him a brilliant future. Cicero improved the next few years by study and travel in Asia and Greece. Shortly after his return in 75, he was elected quaestor, and thus became a member of the Senate. His year of office he spent in Sicily, in the performance of his duties. There he obtained an insight into the corrupt extortions of the Roman governors, 5 years later, he conducted his famous case against Verres. Verres had been a follower of Sulla, and during the proscriptions had amassed some property. Afterwards he held official positions in Greece and Asia, where he became notorious for his greediness and cruelty. With the money thus acquired, he had bought his election to the praetorship, became senator, and was sent by his colleagues to govern Sicily. His government there may have been no worse than that of many other proconsuls in the different provinces, but we have a fuller account of it owing to the prosecution of Cicero, whose speeches against Verres are preserved. Verres was governor of Sicily for 3 years. In his official position he was judge of all civil and criminal cases. Every suit brought before him he gave to the party that could pay him best. Property was confiscated on false charges, and works of art of great value were stolen. By such a course Verres collected, it is said, property to the value of $4,000,000. Two-thirds of this he expected to spend in silencing accusations. The rest he hoped to enjoy in peace, but Cicero's eloquence forced him to abandon his defense and retire into exile. It was about this time that Caesar finished his rhetorical studies abroad and returned home. He was elected military tribune as a reward for what he had accomplished in Caria. 2 years later, in 68, he was elected quaestor, thereby acquiring a seat in the Senate. At this time his aunt Julia died, and, as one of her nearest relatives, he delivered the funeral oration. Caesar was now beginning to know Pompey, and saw that their interests were common. The latter, although but 6 years older, was already a great man and a distinguished soldier. Cornelia, Caesar's wife, died, and he married for a second wife Pompeia, the cousin of Pompey. When sent as quaestor to Farther Spain in 67, he completed the work begun by Pompey and settled the finances of the troubled country, a task which he found the easier as he was known to belong to the popular party, of which Marius and Sergius had been leaders. Chapter 28. Troubles at Rome. Conspiracy of Catalina. While Pompey was absent in the East, matters at Rome were daily becoming worse, and shaping themselves for the speedy overthrow of the Republic. There were many who had suffered under Sulla, and who were anxious to regain what they had lost, and there were many who, enriched by the dictator, had squandered their ill-gotten wealth, and now only waited a leader to renew the assault upon the state. The Senate was jealous of the power of the people, and the people distrusted the Senate. Among the patricians who were aspiring to the consulship was Lucius Sergius Catalina, a villain steeped in every crime, but adroit, bold, and withal captivating. In 68 he had been praetor, the next year governor in Africa, where by his extortions he had obtained enough money, as he hoped, to purchase his election to the consulship. On his return home he was impeached for his misgovernment, but acquitted through Cicero's defense and the careful selection of a jury. He then came forward as candidate for the consulship of the next year, in 63. There were 2 other candidates, Antonius, the uncle of Mark Antony, and Cicero himself. Antony was sure of an election, so the struggle was really between Catalina and Cicero. The latter was elected, owing to the popularity he had acquired by his prosecution of Verres, and his defense of the Manilian law. Thus Cicero reached the goal for which he had been so long striving. Caesar was rising at the same time. The year previous, in 65, he had been curule aedile, had built a row of costly columns in front of the Capitol, and erected a temple to the Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux. But what made him especially pleasing to the populace was his lavish display at the public games and exhibitions. Caesar was now looked upon as a prominent democratic leader. In 63, the office of Pontifex Maximus, the head of the state religion, became vacant by the death of its occupant, Metellus Pius. Caesar became a candidate for the office and was elected, receiving more votes than both the rival candidates combined. He also received further evidence of the popular favor by being chosen praetor for the next year in 62. Cicero's consulship would have closed without adding anything to his fame had it not been for Catalina. The latter's failure to be elected caused him to enter into a plot to seize and burn the city. He had many followers, men of noble families, among whom were the former consul Lentulus, who had been recently expelled from the Senate by the censors, and Sergius, a bankrupt spendthrift, who was anxious to regain a fortune by a change in government. There were veterans of Sulla, starving peasants who had been dispossessed of their farms, and outlaws of every description. The conspirators were divided into two parties: those outside the city, headed by Marcus Manlius, whose headquarters were at Fiesole, where was gathered an army of trained soldiers, and those inside of the city, headed by Catalina. Here secret meetings were held, the purpose of which was to excite an uprising, kill the magistrates, seize the government, and then unite with the army in Etruria. Cicero was informed of these meetings by spies, and just before the plans for the uprising were matured, he disclosed them to the Senate. Catiline fled from Rome, but his accomplices, of whom Lentulus and Cethégus were the most prominent, were arrested in the city. A serious difficulty now arose as to the disposition of the prisoners. Lentulus was at that time praetor, and the persons of public officers were sacred. The Sempronian law of Gracchus forbade the executing of any Roman citizen without giving him a right of appeal to the assembly. Too many were implicated in the conspiracy for this to be safe. In the debate in the Senate, the principal speakers were Caesar, Cato, and Cicero. Cato and Cicero advocated immediate death, Caesar imprisonment for life. The motives of the men are so characteristic that they form a complete key to their several public careers. Cicero, vain and selfish, weak in counsel, and distrustful of the temper of the people and of his own ability to rule their factions, feared that they would become dangerous enemies to himself. Cato, desiring the reformation of the state, would make an example and warning for the future. The one, forgetful of the state, was overcome by personal fears. The other, unmindful of self, would have purity at any cost. Caesar, on the other hand, wished everything done in strict accordance with the laws. As a bold and wise statesman, he urged that nothing was more impolitic than lawless violence on the part of the rulers. Cicero was the timid magistrate, Cato the injudicious reformer, but Caesar, with his keener knowledge and stronger hand, was the safer guide. A sentence of death was voted, and Cicero, with unseemly haste, caused the conspirators to be strangled that same night, December the 5th, 63. The suppression of the conspiracy in the city was followed by the defeat of the army in Etruria. Thither Catiline had fled, and there he fell fighting with desperate courage at the head of his motley force of soldiers near Pistoria. The name of Father of his Country was given to Cicero for the vigilance shown in this affair. The execution of Lentulus and Cethegus resulted as Caesar had expected. It was a lawless act on the part of the consul and the Senate, and it was felt that by it the constitution was still more endangered. The people demanded that Pompey return. In him they thought to have a deliverer from internal strifes. Cicero was wrapped up in his own conceit, imagining himself a second Romulus. On the last day of the year 63, as was the custom of the returning consuls, he arose in the Forum to deliver a speech, reviewing the acts of his year of consulship. Metellus Nepos, a tribune, forbade his speaking on the ground that one who had put to death Roman citizens without a hearing did not deserve to be heard. Amid the uproar, Cicero could only shout that he had saved his country. Metellus threatened to impeach him, and excitement in the city was at fever heat. The tribune moved before the assembly that Pompey be recalled. The Senate feared his coming. Caesar, who was now praetor, judge, favored it, and earnestly seconded the proposal of Metellus. Cato, who was also tribune, ordered Metellus to stop speaking, and snatched his manuscript from his hand. The aristocrats drew their swords and broke up the meeting. Constitutional law was trampled underfoot on all sides. The Senate was riding roughshod over all opponents. Metellus and Caesar were declared deposed from their offices. The people, however, believed in Caesar. He was followed to his home by crowds who begged him to be their leader and make an example of the lawbreakers in the Senate. But Caesar refused. He would have nothing to do with lawlessness. He let his opponents play that role, and awaited the results. The Senate soon saw its mistake, and requested him to resume his official duties. The next year, 61, Caesar was sent to farther Spain as praetor. He had already left a favorable impression there as quaestor. Portions of the country were still unsubdued. Many of the mountain passes were held by robbers, whose depredations caused much trouble. He completed the subjugation of the peninsula, put down the brigands, reorganized the government, and sent large sums of money to the treasury at Rome. His administration was thorough and complete, and a just reward for it would, he hoped, be the consulship. Meanwhile, Pompey had returned from the east. He landed at Brundisium in December 62, and proceeded with a large band of captured princes and immense treasures to Rome, which he entered in triumph amidst the greatest enthusiasm. By a special vote of the Senate, he was permitted to wear his triumphal robe in that body whenever he pleased. Caesar returned from Spain in 60, with wealth and military fame. Though feared and detested by the Senate, he was the favorite of the people and could depend upon their support. Pompey had the army behind him. He received Caesar with pleasure, for he had been a friend in all his career. Caesar felt that, with the people and the army through Pompey, on his side. He only needed the capitalists to make his success sure. Crassus was counted as the richest man at Rome. He was won over. These three then formed what is known as the first Triumvirate, a union of shrewdness, renown, and riches, by which Caesar expected to rise to great power, Pompey to retain his power, and Crassus to gain greater wealth. End of chapter 28. Chapters 29 through 30 of History of Rome from the earliest times down to 476 A.D. by Robert F Pennell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Richardson. Chapter 29. The First Triumvirate. Pompey was ostensibly at the head of the First Triumvirate, and in return supported Caesar in his candidacy for the consulship. Crassus was to contribute his wealth to influence the election. Caesar was elected without opposition in 59. His colleague, the Senate's tool, was Marcus Bibulus. Caesar had now reached the highest round in the ladder of political offices. He had shown himself in all his course to be grateful in keeping within the bounds of the constitution, never exerting himself in political quarrels except to defend the law against lawlessness. Now he was in a position to push his ideas of reform, and to show the aristocracy of what stuff he was made. It would have been well for Cicero, and better for the state, had the orator been willing to join hands with Caesar and Pompey. But he was too vain of his own glory to join hands with those who were his superiors, and he clung to the Senate, feeling that his talents would shine there more, and be more likely to redound to his own personal fame. Caesar's consulship increased his popularity among all except the aristocrats. His agrarian law, carefully framed and worded, was bitterly opposed by the Senate, especially by his colleague Bibulus and by Cato. The law provided that large tracts of the Ager Publicus, then held on easy terms by the rich patricians, be distributed among the veterans of Pompey. Caesar proposed to pay the holders a reasonable sum for their loss, though legally they had no claim whatever on the land. Although Bibulus interfered, Cato raved, and the tribunes vetoed, still the assembly passed the law, and voted in addition that the Senate be obliged to take an oath to observe it. The leges Juliae were a code of laws which Caesar drew up during his year of office. They mark an era in Roman law, for they cover many crimes the commission of which had been for a long time undermining the state. The most important of these was the Lex Direptandus, aimed at the abuses of governors of provinces. It required all governors to make a double return on their accounts, one to be left in the province open for inspection, the other to be kept at Rome. When Caesar's term of office was nearly ended, he obtained from the reluctant Senate his appointment as proconsul of Gaul for 5 years. He must leave the city, however, in safe hands, otherwise all his work would be undone. He managed the consular elections for the next year, in 58, so adroitly that Piso and Gabinius, on whose friendship he could rely, were elected. There were in Rome, however, 2 men whom it would be dangerous for Caesar to leave behind. Cato, the ultra-aristocrat, hated him bitterly. Cicero, whose ambition was to lead the Senate a body only too willing to crush Caesar, might do him great harm. It was Caesar's good fortune, or, as some believe, the result of his own scheming, that both these men were put temporarily out of the way. Claudius Poker was a young aristocrat, notorious for his wildness. At one time, by assuming the dress of a woman, he had gained admittance to the festival of Bonadea, which was celebrated only by women. He was discovered and brought to trial before the Senate, but acquitted by means of open bribery. Cicero had been instrumental in bringing him to trial, and Claudius never forgot it. He got adopted into a plebeian family in order to be a candidate for the tribuneship, and was successful. He then proposed to the assembly that any person who had put to death a Roman citizen without allowing him to appeal to the people be considered a violator of the constitution. The proposal was carried. All knew that Cicero was meant, and he fled at once to Macedonia. His property was confiscated, his houses were destroyed, and his palace in the city was dedicated to the goddess of liberty. The kingdom of Cyprus, which had long been attached to that of Egypt, had been bequeathed to Rome at the death of Ptolemy Alexander in 80. The Senate had delayed to accept the bequest, and meanwhile the island was ruled by Ptolemy of Cyprus, one of the heirs of the dead king. Claudius, on the plea that this king harbored pirates, persuaded the assembly to annex the island and to send Cato to take charge of it. He accepted the mission and was absent 2 years. His duties were satisfactorily performed, and he returned with about $7 millions to increase the Roman treasury. Thus Cicero and Cato being out of the city, the Senate was without a leader who could work injury in Caesar's absence. Chapter 30. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul. Caesar was now in the prime of manhood, in the full vigor of mind and body. His previous experience in camp life had been comparatively small. His early service in Asia, and his more recent campaigns in Spain, however, had shown his aptitude for military life. The Romans had already obtained a foothold in Gaul. Since 118, the southern part of the country along the seaboard had been a Roman province, called Gallia Narbonensis, from the colony of Narbo which the Romans had founded. The rest of Gaul included all modern France, and a part of Switzerland, Holland, and Belgium. The inhabitants were all of the Celtic race, except a few Germans who had crossed the Rhine and settled in the north, and the Aquitani, who lived in the southwest, and who are represented by the Basques of today. The Gauls were more or less civilized since they had come into contact with the Romans, but they still had the tribal form of government, like the early Romans. There were more than 50 of these tribes, which were mostly hostile to one another, as well as divided into factions among themselves. This condition favored a conquest, for the factions were frequently Roman and non-Roman. 2 of the chief tribes were the Aedui and the Sequani. The former had been taken under the protection of Rome. The latter, impatient of control and Roman influence, had invited a tribe of Germans under Ariovistus to come into Gaul and settle, and be their allies. These Germans had attacked and conquered the Aeduans, taken from them hostages, and with the Sequanians were in the ascendancy. In Switzerland lived the Helvetii, They had so increased in numbers that their country was too small for them. They therefore proposed to emigrate farther into Gaul, and the Sequanians, whose lands bordered on those of the Helvetians, gave them permission to march through their country. Such was the state of affairs when Caesar arrived in Gaul. Feeling that the passage of such a large body of emigrants, 368,000, through Gaul would be dangerous to the province, Gallia Narbonensis, he determined to interfere. The Helvetians were met at Bibracte, near Autumn, and after a terrible battle, which raged from noon until night, were defeated with great slaughter in 58. The survivors, about one-third, were treated kindly, and most of them sent back to Switzerland. Caesar now turned his attention to the Germans who had settled west of the Rhine, after several fruitless attempts at negotiation, during which the bad faith of Ariovistus became conspicuous. The forces came together. Though the Germans were brave, they were no match for the drilled legionaries, who fought with the regularity of a machine. Few of the barbarians escaped, but among these was Ariovistus. The campaigns of this year being ended, the legions were sent into winter quarters among the Sequanians under Labienus, the lieutenant of Caesar. He himself went into Cisalpine Gaul to attend to his duties as administrator, and to have communication with his friends at Rome. The war with the Belgae. While Caesar was in Hither Gaul, he learned from Labienus that the Belgae were forming a league to resist the Romans. This people occupied the northeastern part of Gaul, and embraced several tribes, of which the principal were the Remi, Bellovaci, Suessiones, and Nervi. The last were the fiercest and least civilized. Caesar raised 2 new legions, making 8 in all, and marched against the Belgae as soon as the spring opened. His sudden approach alarmed the Remi, who lived nearest to central Gaul, and they immediately put themselves under his protection. From them he learned that the Belgae could muster about 300,000 men. By skilful tactics and a successful attack, he put to flight and nearly annihilated the Suessiones. The Bellovaci now put themselves under his protection, but the Nervii remained in arms. One day, while the 6 legions were forming camp on the bank of the river Sabis, the Nervii and their allies suddenly rushed upon them from an ambuscade in the woods on the opposite bank. The troops were entirely unprepared, and so quick was the enemy's charge that the Romans had not time to put on their helmets, to remove the covering from their shields, or to find their proper places in the ranks. Great confusion followed, and they became almost panic-stricken. Caesar rushed into their midst, snatched a shield from a soldier, and by his presence and coolness revived their courage. The Nervii were checked, and victory was assured. But the enemy fought on with a bravery that excited the admiration of Caesar. Of 60,000 men, scarcely 500 survived. The women and children were cared for kindly by Caesar, and settled in their own territory. The Aduatuci, who had assisted the Nervii in their struggle, were conquered by Caesar and sold into slavery. Thus ended the Belgian campaign, 57. The legions were put into winter quarters near where the war had been waged, and Caesar went to Italy. In his honor was decreed a thanksgiving lasting 15 days. The Veneti invasion of Germany. All the tribes in the northwestern part of Gaul, Brittany, except the Veneti, had given hostage to Crassus, son of Triumvirate and lieutenant of Caesar. This tribe refused to give hostages, and, inducing others to join them, seized some of Roman officers sent among them by Crassus. The campaign of the third year, in 56, was directed against these people. They were mostly sailors and fishermen, with villages built on the end of promontories and easily defended by land. In a naval engagement which lasted nearly all day, their whole fleet was destroyed. The leaders of the Veneti were put to death for their treachery in seizing Roman officers, and the rest were sold into slavery. The legions spent the winter of 56 to 55 in the northern part of Gaul, among the Aulerci and neighboring tribes. During this winter another wave of Germans passed over the Rhine into Gaul. They had been driven from their homes by a powerful tribe called the Suevi. In the spring of 55, Caesar collected his troops and advanced to within 12 miles of the German camp, and gave the invaders 24 hours to leave the country. Before the expiration of the time, they attacked Caesar's outposts, killing several knights and 2 men of aristocratic families. In the general engagement that followed, the Germans were totally routed, and most of them were slain. Caesar next determined to cross the Rhine into Germany, thinking thus to inspire the Germans with greater fear of the Romans. He built his famous bridge, crossed it, remained 18 days in Germany, and, thinking his object accomplished, returned to Gaul, destroying the bridge behind him. Invasion of Britain. It was now August, and Caesar occupied the rest of the season by crossing the Channel to Britain, England. Landing near Deal, but with little resistance on the part of the natives, he explored the country for a short time, and returned in September, as the equinox was near and the weather unsettled. The legions were sent into winter quarters among the Belgae, and Caesar set out for Cisalpine Gaul. During this winter, 55 to 54, orders were given to build a large fleet, as Caesar intended to return to Britain the next year. After all preparations were completed, he set sail July 20th, 54, and the next day landed on the island. He defeated the Britons under their leader Cassivellaunus, and compelled them to pay tribute and give hostages. Many thousand prisoners were taken and sold in Italy as slaves. Final struggles of the Gauls. In the winter of 54 to 53, the legions were distributed among several tribes. That stationed in the territory of the Eburones was commanded by the lieutenants Gabinus and Cotta. News reached the encampment that there was an uprisal of the Eburones. It was decided to break up camp and go, if possible, to the winter quarters of their nearest companions. On the march they were surprised and nearly all killed. Only a few stragglers carried the news to Labienus, who was wintering with a legion among the Remi. This success moved the Nervii to attack Quintus Cicero, the lieutenant who was wintering with his legion among them. word was sent to Caesar, who had fortunately not yet left Gaul. He hastened to Cicero's relief, raised the siege, and all but annihilated the revolting Nervii. In 53, Caesar punished the Eburones for their action in the previous winter. The tribe was completely destroyed, but their leader, Ambiorix, escaped and was never captured. During the summer, Caesar again crossed the Rhine. At the close of the summer, he returned to Cisalpine Gaul, supposing that the Gauls were totally subdued. He was mistaken. The patriotism of the people was not yet extinguished. The chiefs of all the tribes secretly established communication with each other. A day was settled upon for a general uprising. The Roman inhabitants of Genabum on the Liger were massacred. The leading spirit in this last struggle of the Gauls was Vercingetorix, chief of the Averni. Caesar hastened across the Alps, surmounted the difficulties of crossing the Cevennes when the snow was very deep, collected his legions, marched upon Genabum, and plundered and burnt the town. Vercingetorix saw that he was no match for the legions in open battle. He proposed, therefore, to cut off Caesar's supplies by burning all the towns of the Bituriges and laying the country waste. Avaricum alone was spared. With its walls were placed the best of their goods and a strong garrison. Thither Caesar marched, and, after a well-defended siege, captured the town and killed every person in it, excepting 800 who escaped to the camp of Vercingetorix. Large quantities of corn were taken, with which Caesar supplied his soldiers. He then marched against Gergovia, the capital of the Averni. As the town was on a high plateau and too strong to be stormed, he laid siege to it. A part of the army, contrary to instructions, one day attempted to assault the place. The battle which followed was disastrous to the Romans, and the only defeat Caesar received in Gaul. 46 officers and 700 men fell. The siege was raised. It was a serious position for Caesar. All Gaul was in flames. Retreating at once, he formed a junction with Labienus at Agendicum, and with all his troops started for Gallia Narbonensis to protect it from invasion. On his route was Alesia. Here Vercingetorix was entrenched with 80,000 troops. It was, like Gergovia, situated on a hill and considered impregnable. Caesar laid siege to this place in 52. Vercingetorix appealed to all Gaul for aid. Hardly had the fortress been invested when Caesar's army was surrounded by an immense force of Gauls that had come to the rescue. Caesar needed now all his skill and genius, but they did not fail him. The relieving army, though 5 times as large as his, was driven back and sent flying home. Seeing that all was over, Vercingetorix called a council of his chiefs and advised surrender. A message was sent to Caesar. He demanded unconditional surrender, and was obeyed. The people were sold into slavery, and the money obtained distributed among the soldiers. Vercingetorix was kept to be exhibited in the triumph at Rome, and afterwards died in a dungeon. With the fall of Alesia, the subjugation of Gaul was practically completed. The next year, 51, Caesar honored several chiefs with privileges. Some of the nobles were granted the franchise, and some admitted to the Senate. The work of Romanizing Gaul was fairly begun. Two provinces were formed, Gallia and Belgica, and later, in 17 A.D., the former of these was subdivided into Lugdunensis and Aquitania. Roman money was introduced, and Latin became the official language. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 through 32 of History of Rome, from the earliest times down to 476 A.D., by Robert F. Pennell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Richardson. Chapter 31, Claudius and Milo, Death of Crassus. During the 9 years, 59 to 50, passed by Caesar in Gaul, great confusion prevailed at Rome. The republic needed a strong, firm hand which would stop the shedding of blood and ensure security of person and property. Pompey had attempted to bring about this result, but had failed. There were two prominent factions, one led by Claudius and the other by Milo. Claudius is the most extraordinary figure in this extraordinary period. He had no character. He had no distinguished talent save for speech. He had no policy. He was ready to adopt any cause or person which for the moment was convenient to him. And yet for 5 years this man was the leader of the Roman mob. He could defy justice, insult the consuls, beat the tribunes, parade the streets with a gang of armed slaves, killing persons disagreeable to him. And in the Senate itself he had high friends and connections, who threw a shield over him when his audacity had gone beyond endurance. Milo was as disreputable as Claudius. His chief fame had been gained in the schools of the gladiators. Gangs of armed slaves accompanied him everywhere, and there were constant collisions between his retainers and those of Claudius. In 57, consuls were elected who favored Cicero, and his recall was demanded. Claudius and his followers opposed the recall. The nobles, led by their tool Milo, pressed it. Day after day the opposing parties met in bloody arrays. For 7 months the brawl continued, till Milo's party finally got the ascendancy. The assembly was convened and the recall voted. For 17 months Cicero had been in Greece, lamenting his hard lot. He landed at Brundisium on August 5, 57, and proceeded to Rome. Outside the city, all men of note, except his avowed enemies, were waiting to receive him. The Senate voted to restore his property and to rebuild his palace on the Palatine Hill, and his other villas at the public expense. But Claudius, with his bands of ruffians, interrupted the workmen engaged in the repair of his Palatine house, broke down the walls, and, attacking Cicero himself, nearly murdered him. At last Claudius even attempted to burn the house of Milo. The long struggle between these two ruffians culminated when Milo was a candidate for the consulship and Claudius for the praetorship, the two meeting by accident in the Via Appia at Bovile. Claudius was murdered 20 January 52. This act of violence strengthened Pompey, who was nominated sole consul. Milo was impeached. His guilt was evident, and he went into exile at Massilia. Cicero prepared an elaborate speech in his defense, but did not dare to deliver it. During the interval between the two campaigns of 57 and 56, Caesar renewed his alliance with his two colleagues in interviews that were held at Ravenna and Lucca. He retained the command of Gaul, Pompey that of Spain, Crassus that of Syria. Crassus now undertook the war against the Parthians. He was accompanied by his son, who had done good service under Caesar in Gaul. They arrived at Zeugma, a city of Syria, on the Euphrates, and the Romans, 7 legions strong, with 4,000 cavalry, drew themselves up along the river. The quaestor, Cassius, a man of ability, proposed to Crassus a plan of the campaign, which consisted in following the river as far as Seleucia, in order not to be separated from his fleet and provisions, and to avoid being surrounded by the cavalry of the enemy. But Crassus allowed himself to be deceived by an Arab chief, who lured him to the sandy plains of Mesopotamia at Carrhae. The forces of the Parthians, divided into many bodies, suddenly rushed upon the Roman ranks and drove them back. The young Crassus attempted a charge at the head of 1,500 horsemen. The Parthians yielded, but only to draw him into an ambush, where he perished after great deeds of valor. His head, carried on the end of a pike, was borne before the eyes of his unhappy father, who, crushed by grief and despair, gave command into the hands of Crassus. Crassus gave orders for a general retreat. The Parthians subjected the Roman army to continual losses, and Crassus himself was killed in a conference in 53. In this disastrous campaign there perished more than 20,000 Romans. 10,000 were taken prisoners and compelled to serve as slaves in the army of the Parthians. The death of Crassus broke the Triumvirate. That of Julia in 54 had sundered the family ties between Caesar and Pompey, who married Cornelia, the widow of the young Crassus, and daughter of Metellus Scipio. Chapter 32. Caesar's struggle with Pompey. Battle of Pharsala. Pompey was elected sole consul in February 52. He at once threw off all pretense of an alliance with Caesar, and devoted himself to the interests of the Senate and aristocracy. The brilliant successes of Caesar in Gaul had made a profound impression upon the minds of the citizens, to whom the name of the northern barbarians was still fraught with terror. Caesar had won for himself distinction as a soldier greater than the Scipios, or Sulla, or Pompey. He was coming back to lay at his country's feet a province larger than Spain, not only subdued, but reconciled and to subjugation, a nation of warriors as much devoted to him as his own legions. The nobility had watched his successes with bitter envy, but they were forced to vote a thanksgiving of 20 days, which the people made 60. Caesar now declared through his followers at Rome that he desired a second consulship, but he wished first to celebrate his triumph, and on this account would not disband his army, for according to the custom he could not triumph without it. According to another custom, however, he must disband it before he could offer himself as a candidate for consulship. But he asked permission to set aside this custom and to become a candidate while he was in the province in command of the army. The law requiring a candidate to give up his command had been suspended several times before this, so that Caesar's request was reasonable. His enemies in the city were numerous and powerful, and he felt that if he returned as a private citizen, his personal safety would be in danger. Whereas, if he were a magistrate, his person would be considered sacred. The Senate, on the other hand, felt that if he carried his point, the days of their influence were numbered. Their first step, therefore, was to weaken Caesar and to provide their champion Pompey with a force in Italy. They voted that Caesar should return to Pompey a legion which had been loaned him, and also should send another legion back to Italy. The vote was taken on the ostensible plea that the troops were needed in Asia Minor against the Parthians. But when they reached Italy, they were placed under Pompey's command in Campania. The consuls chosen for the year 49 were both bitter enemies of Caesar. He had taken up his winter quarters at Ravenna, the last town in the province bordering on Italy. From here he sent a messenger with letters to the Senate, stating that he was ready to resign his command if Pompey did the same. The message arrived at Rome January 1st, 49, on the day in which the new consuls entered upon their duties. The letters were read in the Senate, and there followed a spirited discussion resulting in a decree that Caesar should resign his command. The tribunes opposed, but being threatened by the consuls, they were compelled to leave the city and went directly to Ravenna. When the action of the Senate was reported to Caesar, he called together his soldiers and addressed them thus: "For 9 years I and my army have served our country loyally and with some degree of success," he said. "We have driven the Germans across the Rhine. We have made Gaul a province, and the Senate, for answer, has broken the constitution in setting aside the tribunes who spoke in my defense. It has voted the state in danger, and has called Italy into arms, when no single act of mine can justify it in this course." End of quote. The soldiers became enthusiastic and were eager to follow their leader without pay. Contributions were offered him by both men and officers. Labienus, his trusted lieutenant, alone proved false. He stole away and joined Pompey. Caesar then sent for 2 legions from across the Alps. With these legions he crossed the Rubicon into Italy and marched to Ariminum. Meanwhile, the report of his movements reached Rome. The aristocracy had imagined that his courage would fail him, or that his army would desert. Thoroughly frightened, consuls, praetors, senators, leaving wives, children, and property to their fate, fled from the city to seek safety with Pompey in Capua. They did not stop even to take the money from the treasury, but left it locked. Caesar paused at Ariminum and sent envoys to the Senate, stating that he was still desirous of peace. If Pompey would depart to his province in Spain, he would himself disband his own troops. He was even willing to have a personal visit with Pompey. This message was received by the Senate after its flight from Rome. The substance of its reply was that Pompey did not wish to have a personal interview, but would go to Spain, and that Caesar must leave Ariminum, return to his province, and give security that he would dismiss his army. These terms seemed to Caesar unfair, and he would not accept them. Accordingly, he sent his lieutenant, Mark Antony, across the mountains to Arretium on the road to Rome. He himself pushed on to Ancona before Pompey could stop him. The towns that were on his march threw open their gates, their garrisons joined his army, their officers fled. Steadily he advanced with constantly increasing forces until when he reached Corfinium, his army had swelled to 30,000 troops. This place had been occupied by Domitius, with a party of aristocrats and a few thousand men. Caesar surrounded the town, and when Domitius endeavored to steal away, his own troops took him and delivered him over to Caesar. The capture of Corfinium and the desertion of its garrison filled Pompey and his followers with dismay. They hurried to Brundisium, where ships were in readiness for them to depart. Hoping to intercept Pompey, Caesar hastened to this port. On his arrival outside of the town, the consuls, with half the army, had already gone. Pompey, however, was still within the place, with 12,000 troops, waiting for transports to carry them away. He refused to see Caesar, and, though the latter endeavored to blockade the port, he was unsuccessful, owing to want of ships. Thus Pompey escaped. With him were the consuls, more than half of the Senate, and the aristocracy. Caesar would have followed them, but a fleet must first be obtained, and matters nearer home demanded his attention. In 60 days Caesar had made himself master of Italy. On his way to Rome he met Cicero, and invited him to attend the Senate, but he preferred to stay away. Caesar entered the city unattended and assembled the Senate through the tribunes, Mark Antony and Cassius Longinus. The attendance was small, as most of the members were with Pompey. In his address to the Senate, Caesar spoke of his own forbearance and concessions, of their unjust demands, and their violent suppression of the authority of the tribunes. He was still willing to send envoys to treat with Pompey, but no one was found willing to go. After 3 days spent in useless discussion, Caesar decided to act for himself. By his own edict, he restored the children of the victims of Sulla's proscription to their rights and property. The money in their treasury was voted him by the assembly of the people. He took as much of it as he needed, and started at once for Gaul to join his troops on his way to Spain. He had much to accomplish. Spain was in the hands of Pompey's lieutenants, Afranius, Petreius, and Varro, who had 6 legions and allied troops. From Sicily and Sardinia came most of the grain supplies of Rome, and it was important to hold these islands. To Sicily he sent Curio, and Sardinia Valerius. Cato, who was in charge of Sicily, immediately abandoned it and fled to Africa. Sardinia received Caesar's troops with open arms. Upon his arrival in Gaul, Caesar found that the inhabitants of Massilia had risen against his authority, led by the same Domitius, whom he had sent away unharmed from Corfinium. Caesar blockaded the city, and leaving Decimus Brutus in charge of operations, continued his journey to Spain. He found Afranius and Petreius strongly entrenched in Catalonia, northern Spain. Within 40 days he brought them to terms, and Varro, who was in southern Spain, was eager to surrender. All Spain was at his feet. Before leaving Spain, Caesar summoned the leading Spaniards and Romans to Cordova for a conference. All promised obedience to his authority. He then set sail from Gades and Tarragona, where he joined his legions and marched back to Massilia, which he found hard pressed and ready to surrender. The gates were opened, all were pardoned, and Domitius was allowed to escape a second time. Caesar left a portion of his forces in Gaul, and with the rest arrived at Rome in the early winter of 49 to 48. Thus far he had been successful. Gaul, Spain, Sardinia, Sicily, and Italy were his. He had not succeeded, however, in getting together a naval force in the Adriatic, and he had lost his promising lieutenant Curio, who had been surprised and killed in Africa, whither he had gone in pursuit of Cato and Pompey's followers. During Caesar's absence, affairs at Rome had resumed their usual course. He had left the city under charge of his lieutenant Aemilius Lepidus, and Italy in command of Mark Antony. Caesar was still at Massilia when he learned that the people of Rome had proclaimed him dictator. Financial troubles in the city had made this step necessary. Public credit was shaken. Debts had not been paid since the civil war began. Caesar allowed himself only 11 days in Rome. In this time estimates were drawn of all debts as they were 1 year before. The interest was remitted and the principal declared still due. This measure relieved the debtors somewhat. It was now nearly a year since Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Pompey, during the 9 months that had elapsed since his escape from Brundisium, had been collecting his forces in Epirus. Here had gathered many princes from the east, a majority of the senatorial families of Rome, Cato and Cicero, the vanquished Afranius, and the renegade Labienus. There were 9 full legions with cavalry and auxiliaries, amounting in all to 100,000 men. Caesar reached Brundisium at the end of the year 49. His forces were fewer in number than those of his adversary, amounting to not more than 15,000 infantry and 600 cavalry. But his legionaries were all veterans, inured to toil and hunger, to heat and cold, and every man was devoted to his leader. On the 4th of January he set sail from Brundisium, landing after an uneventful voyage at Acroceraunia. He advanced at once towards Dyrrhachium, where were Pompey's headquarters, occupied Apollonia, and entrenched himself on the left bank of the river Apsus. The country was well disposed and furnished him with ample supplies. Caesar sent back the vessels on which he crossed to transport his remaining troops, but they were intercepted on their way across and many of them destroyed. He was therefore compelled to confine himself to trifling operations until his lieutenant Mark Antony could fit out a second fleet and bring over the remainder of his legions. When Antony finally crossed, he landed 100 miles up the coast. Pompey's forces were between him and Caesar, and his position was full of danger. But Caesar marched rapidly round Dyrrhachium and joined him before Pompey knew of his movements. The great general was now ready for action. He built a line of strongly fortified forts around Pompey's camp, blockading him by land. He turned the streams of water aside, causing as much inconvenience as possible to the enemy. So the siege dragged on into June. 2 deserters informed Pompey of a weak spot in Caesar's line. At this point, Pompey made a sudden attack. For once, Caesar's troops were surprised and panic-stricken. Even his own presence did not cause them to rally. Nearly 1,000 of his men fell, 32 standards, and a few hundred soldiers were captured. This victory was the ruin of Pompey's cause. Its importance was exaggerated. His followers were sure that the war was practically over, and so certain were they of ultimate success that they neglected to follow up the advantage gained and gave Caesar opportunity to recover from the blow. The latter now retired from the seaboard into Thessaly. Pompey followed, confident of victory. The nobles in his camp amused themselves with quarreling about the expected spoils of war. Cato and Cicero remained behind in Epirus, the former disgusted at the actions of the degenerate nobility, the latter pleading ill health. The two armies encamped on a plain in Thessaly near the river Enipeus, only 4 miles apart. Between them lay a low hill called Pharsalus, which gave name to the battle which followed. The Battle of Pharsalia, August 9th, 48, has acquired a special place in history, because it was fought by the Roman aristocracy in their own persons in defense of their own supremacy. Senators and the sons of senators, the heirs of the names and fortunes of the ancient Roman families, the leaders of society in Roman salons, and the chiefs of the political party of the Optimates, the aristocracy, were here present on the field. The other great actions were fought by the ignoble multitude, whose deaths were of less significance. The plains of Pharsalia were watered by the precious blood of the elect of the earth. For several days the armies watched each other without decisive action. One morning, toward the end of May, August 9, Old Style, Caesar noticed a movement in Pompey's lines that told him the expected attack was coming. The position of the senatorial army was well taken. Its right wing rested on the Enipeus. Its left was spread out on the plain. Pompey himself commanded the left with the 2 legions the Senate had taken from Caesar. Outside him on the plain were his allies, covered by the cavalry. Opposite Pompey was Caesar, with the famous 10th Legion. His left and center were led by his faithful tribunes Mark Antony and Crassus Longinus. At the given signal, Caesar's front ranks advanced on a run, threw their darts, drew their swords, and closed in. At once Pompey's cavalry charged, outflanking the enemy's right wing, and driving back the opposing cavalry, who were inferior in numbers. But as they advanced, flushed with victory, Caesar's 4th line, which he had held in reserve, and which was made up of the flower of his legions, appeared in their way. So fierce was their attack that the Pompeians wavered, turned, and fled. They never rallied. The 4th line threw themselves upon Pompey's left wing, which was now unprotected. This wing, composed of Caesar's old veterans, was probably in no mood to fight its former comrades in arms. At any rate, it turned and fled. Pompey himself mounted his horse and rode off in despair. Thus the battle ended in a rout, but 200 of Caesar's men fell, while 15,000 of the enemy lay dead on the field. The abandoned camp was a remarkable sight. The luxurious patricians had built houses of turf with ivy trained over the entrances to protect their delicate skins from the sun's rays. Couches were stretched out ready for them to take repose after their expected victory, and tables were spread with dainty food and wines on which to feast. As he saw these preparations, Caesar exclaimed, quote, "These are the men who accused my suffering, patient army, which needed the common necessaries of life, of dissoluteness and profligacy." End of quote. But Caesar could not delay. Leaving a portion of his forces in camp, by rapid marching he cut off the retreat of the enemy. 24,000 surrendered, all of whom were pardoned. Domitius, whom we saw at Confinium and Marsilia, was killed trying to escape. Labienus, Afranius, and Petreius managed to steal away by night. Thus ended the battle of Pharsalia. End of chapter 32.